The Pumpkin Field. The city of Paskki is a well-known place in northern Michigan. Resting on the shores of beautiful Lake Michigan, Paskki is truly a city that offers year-round entertainment. Fall is especially beautiful as forests and hills are ablaze with bright colors of the season. And if you follow Mitchell Street west, downtown, past quaint old homes and shops, you'll find that the city fades quickly and gives way to acres of rolling fields. It is here, on the outskirts of this quaint town, where a truly horrifying occurrence takes place each year from late summer to early fall. An occurrence so frightening that many local residents avoid this area altogether, at least until the pumpkins are gone. Several years ago, an old man purchased a large farm that bordered Mitchell Street. He had no family, and soon after he arrived, he did a strange thing. He built a 7-foot fence all around the farm. The fence was tall enough so that people passing by couldn't see on the other side. A large gate guarded the driveway, preventing unwanted visitors. And nothing seemed to happen at the farm until the month of October. In October, the gate in front of his driveway opened. A large, crudely made wooden sign read, "Free pumpkins, you pick." Not many people could pass up the offer of free pumpkins, and the driveway and sides of the road were soon filled with cars, their occupants returning with very large pumpkins. And the old man was strangely absent. Some people pounded on the front door of his house, wanting to thank him for his generosity, but no one saw him watching from the upstairs window. Watching, smiling a crooked smile, gazing down at the people scouring his pumpkin field. One such family that stopped to get a pumpkin was the Nichols family from the nearby village of Wolverine. Peter Nichols and his wife Rebecca, their daughter Christine, and son Brian had been shopping in Paskki. On their way home, they saw the line of cars on both sides of the road. And when they saw the wooden sign advertising free pumpkins, Mr. Nichols decided to stop. It was a decision Mr. Nichols and his entire family would soon regret. Brian picked out a pumpkin. It was large, nearly twice the size of a basketball. Mr. Nichols had to struggle to carry it to the car. He did so happily, however, since the pumpkin didn't cost the family a single penny. On the ride home, Christine and Brian argued about what kind of face to carve in the pumpkin. Christine wanted a smiling, happy face, while Brian wanted a pumpkin with beady eyes and sharp teeth. In the end, Brian won out, and it was decided that the pumpkin would have a scary face, but not too scary. The Nichols had no idea just how scary their pumpkin would turn out to be. Upon arriving home, Mrs. Nichols prepared a place on the porch to carve the pumpkin. She spread out newspapers, and Mr. Nichols carried the large pumpkin from the car and placed it on the papers. A sharp knife was retrieved from the cupboard in the kitchen. Mr. Nichols carved a large hole in the top of the pumpkin, and the four took turns removing the cool, wet, seed-filled goo. When this was finished, they again took turns carving the pumpkin. Mr. and Mrs. Nichols carved the eyes, Christine carved the nose, and Brian carved a sinister, toothy grin. When a candle was lit and placed inside, all agreed that the pumpkin looked quite frightening. After a while, the candle was extinguished, and Mr. Nichols brought the pumpkin inside and placed it near the fireplace. And the Nichols family went to bed. But the very next morning would bring a strange discovery. The family arose and had breakfast, but when Mr. Nichols walked into the living room, the pumpkin was no longer sitting next to the fireplace. It was now sitting in a rocking chair, glaring up at him. And it may have been only his imagination, but Mr. Nichols thought he saw the chair rock ever so slightly. He asked his wife and children if they had moved the pumpkin, knowing full well that the enormous gourd was far too heavy for Rebecca or Brian or Christine to lift it. Everyone denied that they had anything to do with the pumpkin in the chair. Mr. Nichols decided that it had been he who had placed the pumpkin in the rocker. He figured that he must have been tired and hadn't remembered doing it. And so he picked up the pumpkin and carried it out to the porch. When Brian and Christine returned from school, the pumpkin was still on the porch, grinning a toothy grin. But unfortunately, neither of the two children noticed the pumpkin had grown 2 new orange teeth. After dinner, Mrs. Nichols stepped onto the porch to light the candle in the pumpkin. As night fell, the face glowed orange in the darkness. Brian and Christine played yard games with other neighborhood children, and they laughed and shouted as the moon rose. Halloween was only 1 day away, and all of the neighborhood kids were very excited. Shortly before 8 p.m., the group of children broke up, each returning to their homes. Soon the lights of the neighboring houses were extinguished, candles and pumpkins were blown out. Most adults, mindful that wild animals may damage the pumpkins, brought them inside for the night, including Mr. Nichols. He blew out the candle inside the pumpkin, completely unaware of the 2 new teeth. He placed the pumpkin by the fireplace and went to bed. Christine awoke at midnight and she was thirsty. She pulled down the covers, climbed out of bed, and headed down the hall toward the kitchen. The pumpkin sat in the middle of the hall. There were no lights on in the house, but timbers of moonbeams angled through the windows, brightening the house with an ashen glow. And Christine wondered why her father had left the pumpkin in the hallway, right in the middle where someone could trip over it. And so, Christine decided that she would try to push the pumpkin to the side. She knelt down, wrapped her arms around it, and pushed. The pumpkin slid on the carpet, but not easily. Christine had to use all of her strength just to make it move 1 single inch. She pushed and pushed, then paused to rest. Suddenly, the pumpkin moved, all by itself. It snapped at Christine's arm, clenching its teeth, trying to sink them into her soft skin. Christine jerked her arm away, and she was almost too late. And she screamed. Her shouts immediately brought her mother and father out of their bedroom and racing into the hall. Even Brian had rocketed out of bed, alarmed by his sister's screaming. He stood in the doorway of his bedroom. A light clicked on. The 2 adults found their daughter backed against the wall, pointing at the pumpkin. She was crying, and she raised her arm to show her mother and father what had happened. No blood had been drawn, and she wasn't cut, but the pumpkin tooth had left a long red scrape around her wrist. On the floor, the pumpkin was on its side. The round cap with the stem had been knocked out, and it lay on the floor. Choking back sobs, Christine explained that she had been trying to move the pumpkin, but it had attacked her by trying to bite her arm. Mr. Nichols shook his head. He didn't know how the pumpkin had come to wind up in the hallway, but he was certain that it hadn't tried to bite his daughter. He knelt down and looked at the lid with the protruding stem and told Christine that she'd probably scraped her arm on its sharp edge, and again he insisted that the pumpkin didn't bite her. He gathered it up in his arms and carried it back to the fireplace. He didn't believe his daughter's story and figured that she'd probably been sleepwalking and had tripped over the pumpkin. But how did the pumpkin get into the hall, he wondered. Christine looked in her arm and then looked at the pumpkin near the fireplace, knowing that she knew the truth. And when she finally crept into bed a few minutes later, she was careful to shut her bedroom door tight. It took her a long time to get back to sleep. But the horror was not over. In fact, for the Nichols family, the horror was just beginning. In the morning, Christine's mother questioned her about the previous night's strange episode. The mark on Christine's arm was still visible, and she stuck with her story. She knew that the pumpkin had tried to bite her. Her mother was unconvinced and told her daughter that it had been late, that she was sleepy and had only imagined the biting episode. But it was Halloween. Brian and Christine had Halloween parties at school, followed by an evening of trick-or-treating. Christine tried to forget about the strange pumpkin, and she and Brian left for school. When they returned in the afternoon, they went to work putting together their Halloween costumes. Both children had decided to make their own costumes this year. Brian was going to be a vampire and Christine a fairy princess. And then the phone rang. It was a neighbor, a friend of Christine's. She told Christine that she wouldn't be joining them for trick-or-treating after all. She'd tripped and sprained her ankle. When she explained to Christine how she had tripped, Christine gasped. She had tripped over a pumpkin in the yard. A large pumpkin, she had said, that didn't belong to her family. The sun sank beneath the trees, and Brian and Christine headed out to meet their friends. However, as the group traveled from house to house, they couldn't help but notice the pumpkins glowing on the front porches. Like the Nichols family, most of the people in the neighborhood had picked out their pumpkins for free from the field near Paskki, and all of the pumpkins were very large. But tonight, they seemed even bigger than they had been. Like they had grown. And their faces, they looked more menacing and frightening, more human-like. Soon it became apparent that there was something very wrong with the pumpkins. At one house, Brian noticed that one of them seemed to actually be moving its mouth up and down. His friends noticed this too, and they began to grow fearful. At the very next house, the pumpkin on the front porch seemed to hiss at them. Some of the children, so frightened at the sight, immediately turned and ran home. Brian and Christine also fled, but it was the sight on their porch that caused them both to stop and stare. The pumpkin on their porch was coming alive. Not only that, but it seemed to be growing arms and legs. The pumpkin hissed and its mouth gaped open hungrily, and the candle became a yellow tongue that flicked back and forth. It was then that both children noticed that the pumpkin no longer had 4 teeth like they had carved, but 6. The pumpkin had 2 new teeth. Teeth they hadn't carved. Suddenly, the front door opened and Mr. Nichols emerged. He saw his 2 children in the yard, staring toward the house. Then he turned to see what they were looking at. Mr. Nichols was horrified. The struggling pumpkin was only a few feet away, and suddenly he leapt forward and kicked it off the porch. It tumbled into the grass and emitted a terrible shriek. Then Mr. Nichols bolted from the porch and again kicked the pumpkin. The gourd broke open, scattering chunks and clumps. He kicked at the pumpkin until it was in several pieces. The pumpkin, now completely destroyed, stopped moving. The children ran inside, followed by their father. Mr. Nichols called a few neighbors, and they too had explained that strange things had started happening with their pumpkins. Pumpkins they had picked out for free from the large fenced-in field on the outskirts of Paskki. So Mr. Nichols decided to find out what was going on. He got into his car and drove back to the field to confront the strange pumpkin farmer. When he arrived, the farmer's house was dark. The gate was closed, but it wasn't locked, and Mr. Nichols got out of his car, opened the gate, and walked up to the shadowy home. But before he got there, he was distracted by a noise from the field. He turned. In the field, hundreds of pumpkins, still on their stalks, were coming alive. They were thrashing about, tethered to their vines, and seemed to be struggling to break free. In the dim light of the moon, he could make out grotesque faces and vines that appeared to be legs and hands. Mr. Nichols was terrified. He ran up to the dark house and pounded on the front door. Inside, a tiny light blinked on, and the door slowly creaked open. The silhouetted form of a man appeared, but it was too dark for Mr. Nichols to make out any features. In a panic, Mr. Nichols asked the man what was going on. The man seemed perplexed, as if he didn't know what Mr. Nichols was talking about. There was a long pause. Nearby, in the field, Mr. Nichols could hear the moans and groans of hundreds of pumpkins. And then, the strange man spoke. "My children," he said. "All of them. On Halloween night, and only on Halloween night, they come alive. They come alive and want to leave their vines and wander the shadows, but they can't. They can't because the poor dears are anchored to the ground by their stalks and roots." Mr. Nichols asked about the other pumpkins, the pumpkins that many area residents had picked for free and taken home. "Ah, yes," the man said. "If they are not destroyed by midnight tonight, they will escape into the night. They will vanish, but they will remain alive to haunt the forests and hills." Suddenly, a light blinked on, and now Mr. Nichols could see the old man, and what he saw made him recoil in shock. The old man's face was that of a carved pumpkin. His skin was orange and his eyes were deep triangles. His mouth, twisted in a carved grin, gaped open, and he began to laugh. The old man began to laugh, a loud, sinister laugh that echoed through the night. Mr. Nichols fled. When he returned home, he went from door to door, explaining what he'd seen. Many people had already witnessed the strange things their pumpkins had been doing, and some had smashed them just like Mr. Nichols had. But he knew there was no way he could inform everyone. At midnight, he returned home, exhausted, and went to bed. In the morning, he explained to his wife and children the bizarre things he'd seen at the old farmer's field. It seemed unbelievable. But later that day, he heard a news report that sent shivers down his spine. Hundreds of people in northern Michigan had reported that overnight their pumpkins had vanished. Many said that strange things had happened to them, like the pumpkins had a mind of their own. But in the morning, all of them were mysteriously missing. Mr. Nichols shuddered and recalled what the old farmer had said. If a pumpkin had been picked and not destroyed by midnight on Halloween, it would escape into the hills and fields to haunt the forest forever. Mr. Nichols tried to imagine just how many pumpkins had vanished, just how many of them were out there, waiting. And if you should travel to Paskki in October and venture west on Mitchell Street a few miles, you just might come across a large field encompassed by a tall fence. And when the time is right, you might see a sign near the open gate that reads, "Free pumpkins, you pick." It is suggested that you not dare enter the old farmer's field, that you continue on your way, that you leave the field and its pumpkins alone. And if you find yourself in northern Michigan, in the forest after dark, beware. For you might just see a flicker of orange hiding within the shadows, waiting, for no one knows just how many of them